handle the truth.
The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman, Seattle. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder, Seattle.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Grid to suppress, Mike Charlie, 4 Tree 5, 9er 2-1. Grid to mark, Mike Charlie, 4-7 Tree 9er, 8-9er, out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck, 2 rounds AGBT, gas TOT 5-3.
And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Denise Simon Experience. We have our little firebrand here who's really on her game, and she's been very kind to accept the invitation to be with us, and that's Mary Margaret Olohan. And she wrote a piece over at the Daily Caller News Foundation, and it was so good that the Daily Signal picked it up. And that is this heartbeat bill in Georgia. And she's been on her game with this one. So with that, welcome, Mary Margaret, to the Denise Simon Experience.
Thanks so much for having me, Denise. So in this piece, I was looking at some of these Hollywood studios that are threatening to boycott Georgia if the legislation goes into effect, and that legislation is the heartbeat bill that Governor Brian Kemp signed in May, saying that no babies can be aborted once there's a heartbeat detected, and it only makes exceptions in case of rape or incest and in cases of the mother's health. And if they do need that abortion in case of rape or incest, they have to file a police report first. So these studios that are saying that they may take their business elsewhere, there's 7 of them so far. It's Netflix, Disney, NBC Universal, Warner Media, Sony, Viacom, and STX Entertainment. So that's 7 so far. It could be more.
Mary Margaret, it almost sounds to me that this is a coordinated thing, because we have up to 7, and I would imagine that number is certainly going to grow. So it's almost as though Planned Parenthood and some other organizations sent out some kind of memos, included the ACLU, that these film studios in Hollywood jumped in on this one so fast. Am I overthinking it?
No, I don't think you're overthinking it at all. I think that's a very probably accurate guess. A lot of these studios use very similar wording when they talk about their plans to maybe boycott Georgia if the legislation goes into effect. A lot of them say, they talk about how they're going to be listening to their actors and producers and watching the situation closely. It's definitely very similar. I wouldn't be surprised if they had all discussed this with one another. Yes. And the only one that actually stayed out of it to a certain extent is STX Entertainment, who they said they had talked to their actors and producers and realized that it would be too detrimental to their business to forego that much money. But in lieu of that, they're going to be donating to the Georgia ACLU to try and. So it's basically the same thing. And now I'm not saying that they're all going to actually go by their word. I mean, that's a lot of business they would all lose if they left Georgia. But at the same time, they're definitely making a grand stand. And the ACLU and Planned Parenthood have both filed lawsuits in Georgia and Alabama, I believe. And I would not be surprised at all if they had coordinated this massive outreach.
Well, they certainly have time to get this through the courts, because this doesn't go into effect until January 1st of 2020. So I would imagine there's going to be a lot of legal wranglings. Now, I don't believe that Georgia and or the governor, Governor Kemp, is necessarily fretting over the dollars that may affect his state. I think it was in the realm of several billion. Is that right?
Yes. Now, he doesn't seem to be too worried about it, but it will affect his state if it does happen, and that will be a bridge they'll have to cross when they get there. But right now, it seems that they're focusing mainly on getting this legislation passed, which is great.
How close do you think that Planned Parenthood is with Hollywood, that this thing happened so fast? Are you seeing any, aside of my conspiracy theory about a memo that went out, but it's almost as though when this all happened too fast. So in other words, Planned Parenthood was watching this legislation, and I think they were already mobilizing some forces.
Oh, I definitely think they were. There's been lots of evidence in the past that Planned Parenthood and Hollywood are knee-deep in all this together. I mean, pretty much every Hollywood starlet is chanting Planned Parenthood's praises. They're all very pro-abortion, so I would be shocked if they were not in cahoots. And that's something I'm looking into right now, actually. So
I bet you are.
To find out.
I bet you are. All right, let me kind of change a little bit of gears on this one, because your piece did mention Planned Parenthood, and that's okay. But if you were to give some advice to the conservatives, to the Republicans, maybe there ought to be some kind of demand that Planned Parenthood change their name, because Planned Parenthood, the word planned, it is an oxymoron in this case when it comes to abortion, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's
right?
laughable. I mean,
did I miss the memo?
It has nothing to do with parenthood. Planned Parenthood could care less about parenthood. They care about making money, and they care about their abortion quota. So I agree with you. It's laughable. I mean, and I don't think that's something they're going to change, because the whole premise of their business relies on them pretending to be a women's reproductive health center. So I don't see them changing that anytime soon. But you're totally right. They care nothing about Planned Parenthood. And so, they don't even care about planning it. They want to end it.
Yes. I mean, I must have missed the memo on this whole thing. But, here's the other thing. They're okay with live birth abortions and abortions, whatever term. So they're okay about that kind of death, but yet when it comes to the death penalty, the Democrats don't want that. So, I mean, Mary Margaret, we need a hearing on this, and you need to be in the panel. I mean, you need to make an opening statement. You need to make an opening statement to some committee in Congress.
I would love that. No, I think you're right. They're very contradictory in their statements. They definitely push the agenda that they care about at the moment, which most of the time appears to be the agenda that's profiting them most. And I can't answer for what their opinions are on the death penalty, but I can say that they care about their abortion quota, and they care about promoting their business above all else. So that's what they're going to focus on.
So let me kind of ask you this one. I feel like we're in a circular motion here when it comes to money, because the government gives subsidies and or monies to Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood turns around and gives a good bit of those monies to campaign contributions. So it's kind of like the Democrats' campaign contributions are coming from taxpayer dollars. Did I overread that one?
No, I don't think you did. I think that's something conservatives have been angry about for a long time. And that's part of the reason Trump's pushed so hard to defund Planned Parenthood. So, that would be fantastic if we could accomplish that. But at the same time, I think that's going to be a long road, so deeply entrenched in everything. And people are used to it now, too. Pretty much everywhere you go is sponsored in some way by Planned Parenthood. You buy a coffee at Starbucks, part of that money is going to end up going to Planned Parenthood, Target, so many other places. So it's something Americans really need to think about, because if you're willing to boycott every single institution that supports Planned Parenthood, your taxpayer dollars are still going to that company in a way. So you're really entrenched in it. And now at this point, I know people, my own family members are saying they want to boycott Netflix because Netflix is saying they're going to leave Georgia if Georgia follows suit. So there's a lot of choices Americans have to make and prioritize what they believe in and who they're willing to support, and that's not easy.
In your work, Mary Margaret, how similar is the Georgia bill to the other states' bills? What do we got, like 2 or 3 others? Got Missouri.
Yeah.
Are they pretty well similar in text?
They're similar, but the Georgia bill is actually less restrictive than a bunch of others. The Georgia bill makes exceptions in cases of rape or incest, and also in case of the health of the mother. And other ones, like the Alabama legislation, that makes no exceptions except in case of the health of the mother. And that's a big difference. And I think pro-abortion advocates looking at this should recognize that. I mean, there's a huge difference in saying we will not allow any abortions except if the mother will die, and we will allow abortions if this child or this girl or woman has been raped by a family member, or raped period, or raped by a family member. So that is something that should be taken into consideration. The Alabama abortion legislation is by far the most restrictive. So, I mean, I think that's what they should be most worried about.
Yeah. And yet we don't see, these Hollywood types, standing there stomping their feet with their hands on their hips about these other states and or whatever other states have some similar piece of legislation in the pipeline, right?
Right. Well, I think the difference is also that Georgia is a major Hollywood film hub right now. I mean, I believe the Avengers are all being filmed there. It's gotten pretty big. I believe next to LA, it's the biggest place for filming. So that's something to take note of. But also, it's true, there are members of Hollywood all over the country that could be protesting in the places they're coming from. But we're seeing this in Georgia. And I would have to agree that there's coordinated efforts here on the part of multiple different pro-abortion agencies in Georgia.
Is there a dovetail effort in this too because of Stacey Abrams and the opportunity that they were working so diligently to turn Georgia Democrat?
There could be. I'm not totally sure about that. The fact remains that when this legislation is being passed in Georgia, these are people that in office that were voted for that are representing the views of the people. So it's not as if these senators are just pulling these ideas out of thin air. These are ideas that people want. I live in Alabama. There's more than half of the citizens in Alabama were for this restrictive abortion legislation. So this is not just something pulled out of thin air. And that's not something you'll hear from pro-abortion advocates. They'll tell you that this is not what the people of Georgia and Alabama want, but it's actually not true.
You also listed or wrote in your piece a fascinating other statistic, and that is, the part about Disney. They're doing some hard consideration on Georgia, and boycotting Georgia, but they do business in China, which is obviously notorious, not only for the Uyghurs in their slave encampments, but there are other human rights issues way beyond the Uyghurs. But then you got the matter of the Emiratis, United Arab Emirates, and Jordan. So, what does Mr. Disney have to say about that one, or is he just selectively quiet?
Well, my colleague Peter Hassan actually wrote that piece that you're talking about, which is a really fascinating look into Disney's partnership with China, because as you're saying, they partner with China where Muslims are put in internment camps regularly for their religious beliefs, and Disney doesn't seem to have a problem with that. But this is also the case with Netflix. Netflix produces in Egypt
Yeah.
and Jordan where abortion is illegal, but they haven't talked about that. I believe Al Jazeera also, they're based out of, I'm blanking on where they're based out of, but I did a piece on that recently, looking into where Al Jazeera is based, and that country actually has abortion illegal too. And yet Al Jazeera went and criticized the Alabama abortion legislation. So there's a lot of these media companies criticizing the Alabama and Georgia abortion legislation, and then they're hypocritically actually in countries where it's illegal, and you don't hear them complaining about that, or they're working with countries where abortion is illegal, which I find fascinating because that's really hypocritical.
Why is Planned Parenthood a global organization anyway? I mean, so not only is the federal government giving dollars to Planned Parenthood for domestic blah, 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 but a lot of those monies end up going to Planned Parenthood, which leaves our country and goes to, other impoverished countries. I mean, so
right.
Do we fully understand the size and scope of Planned Parenthood to begin with?
No, I'd probably say we don't. That's something that involves a lot of investigative work on the part of many journalists, which I find fascinating and I would love to look into more. But I will say that I think Planned Parenthood extends its reach as far as it can because, again, they care about their abortion quota and they care about not the lives of babies or families, but about fulfilling their abortion quota. So they'll reach as far as they can and do whatever is necessary to fill that.
And, we keep talking about women's health, but it's really not it's not a women's health organization. Does the Disney, Netflix crowd even realize that, or do they just not care? They're just going political on us.
I think they've gone political on us, but I also think that people are very naive when it comes to Planned Parenthood, and they believe what they want to believe. And in emotion-based politics, Planned Parenthood is a place that helps these women that need abortions in their times of need. And so people view Planned Parenthood as this crutch for women that need this abortion to get them out of this horrible situation. So I think there's a very misguided view of Planned Parenthood. They're very casual. I called the other day inquiring about a story, and I said that I was a reporter and mentioned that I was looking for the details I was looking for, and they asked me if I needed an abortion. That's pretty casual. That's pretty freaking casual. So, yeah.
So they're operating on a script. Whoever's answering the phone obviously is operating on a script.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, let me throw you some more sand in the gears if I can. I'm really good at this with my radio guests. Mm-hmm. Planned Parenthood is a nonprofit, but they're a profit center. Help me with that one.
That's something we're looking into as well. I mean, that's where it gets complicated. I mean, I actually am not a great source to talk to on that. I'd love to hear more what you have to say. I was just putting
it out there because I don't think a lot of the listeners necessarily understand that. And when you're a nonprofit center and you're making a profit, then you're in violation of the law. But then right. You're also in violation of the law because they're practicing politics, and a 501c3 cannot practice politics. So
right.
We have a double issue here when it comes to Planned Parenthood, and I guess Hollywood's okay with that too.
I guess they are. They seem to be okay with a lot of things, so I wouldn't be surprised.
So, how come we're not having hearings on Planned Parenthood and the real scope of all the stuff within Planned Parenthood that it might send a shockwave to Hollywood?
I think there have been many people that have tried to bring this into light. One of these people is Lila Rose, who's really, she's the founder of Live Action. She's really good at getting those details out in front of the public, and she uses social media to do that, which is really awesome. But at the same time, you can't always find something to use to get Planned Parenthood up in front of an audience, and sometimes you have to work at it in smaller ways and show like the different ways that that Planned Parenthood might be failing in other ways, and then you never know what you'll find down the road. So I think it involves good people. Keep working, keep at it, keep trying to chip away.
Well, where do we go from here? I mean, do you have some kind of prediction that are you out there watching for ACLU and, any of the other organizations with their lawsuits?
Oh, I am. Yeah, I'll be keeping an eye on it, seeing where this goes. I'm very curious to see whether the ACLU's lawsuit, how that goes, in both Georgia and Alabama, and I'm very curious to see if these Hollywood studios keep their word and back out of Georgia, because I don't believe they all will.
I don't think so
that
either.
They're all posturing, so it'll be really interesting to see what they do.
And will the Southern Poverty Law Center be part of this too?
Oh, they already are. Are.
I should have guessed that one. They have a lawsuit in the pipeline?
I believe they're cooperating with the ACLU.
Do we have any other organizations? Do we have, Open Society or, any of these other, DC Thinks kind of things that you're aware of?
Not that I am aware of, but I'm sure that they are. I just am not familiar with them right now.
So you're just making phone calls and you're in an investigative mode, certainly, finding out what other studios, of Hollywood are going to jump in on this, and then from lawsuits. So I would say this is a rather daunting experience for you, or a challenge, adventure.
It is, but it's exciting. It's exciting to see what's going on and where this will lead to, and it's really interesting to see all this anti-abortion legislation being passed. I mean, this is pretty new. This is a lot of wins in a short period of time, so it's exciting.
Is anybody even mentioning 10th Amendment, state law protections, or state constitution?
I haven't heard of that much recently, but maybe they will. Maybe it'll come up.
I mean, that to me is kind of remarkable. I mean, you got Hollywood taking on state legislatures, which, is really a states' right, states' voting, authority. And it kind of boggles the mind that, none of these people, none of these actors and actresses that, want to go out there and grandstand are being challenged on the 10th Amendment.
Right.
Do you find that a little weird? I
do. I think that they carry, these Hollywood starlets and producers and CEOs, they carry a lot of power with them, in that they have this amazing social image that scares many people. And though they should not, they have a lot of power in their voice, and it influences people for better or for worse. So I think that their position is pretty dangerous for the pro-life movement, and I'm very curious to see where this goes.
Did you happen to see any of the comments to your piece on Daily Signal or Daily Caller? Did you happen to read?
No, I don't normally look.
They were actually, I like to read through. I like to see who's going to argue. They argue among themselves often, and it was really kind of fascinating about how many are so disgusted with Hollywood, period. And it isn't just,
right.
It goes way beyond the Planned Parenthood abortion issue. So the comments were really quite gratifying. So you might want to
kind of check them out.
Yeah, you might want to kind of capitalize on that. I'm so pleased at the work that you're doing. It is going to be an adventure.
Thank you so much.
It'll be a big adventure to see if you can get a phone call into CBS or Showtime or Sony or Netflix and see what they necessarily have to say. And while you're over there, I think some of the Obama's administration people are over there too. But maybe you can get a response and include their comments into one of your pieces. But thanks so much, Margaret, for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience. Great work, and we appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. I really love coming on.
Thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, there's more coming your way, so stay with us. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for hanging with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. Dr. Jason Piccolo is with us. Now, Dr. Jason is a former special agent supervisor with the Department of Homeland Security. You know, he did his time down there at the, I guess the San Diego sector. I don't know if they call them sectors in San Diego, but they did in other places. And this, you know, he kind of intersected with the narco smuggling and sexual trafficking and unaccompanied alien kids. And he's a whistleblower, and he's the author of a book titled Unwavering, and he's been kind enough to join us. So thank you, Dr. Jason Piccolo.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
You must be familiar with Derek Maltz, are you?
Kind of sounds, yeah. Derek Maltz, definitely, yeah.
He's been on my show.
DEA-SOD. He's awesome.
Yes.
I just read a book he was part of called Hunting LaRoe. Really good book.
Yeah, I have it on my list, but I got about 60 books I read at the same time. Depends upon what room I'm in. He's been on my show several times, and he and I text from time to time. I'm leaving him alone right now because he's working on a special project that I can't talk about. They won't let me talk about. But, you know, first of all, thank you for doing all the stuff that you did and are still doing, because I think you're still, hearing the call, correct?
Yeah, I'm always on the news talking about the border and about all the good work that's being done by the agents and the officers. You know, there's so much more to it than just politics. So that's kind of what I'm always on TV about.
Well, there is, and obviously, I'm calling it not an invasion anymore. I've gone to using the word incursion, which is kind of has a military connotation to it. But I don't think I'm wrong, am I, Jason?
Well, you know, if you think about it in military terms, think about when we went to Iraq and we pushed in from Kuwait, and you're moving a whole division. Let's say you're moving 30,000 troops. That's a lot of logistics. Now, when you go down south and you're moving 30,000 aliens, migrants, or whatever you want to call them, from Central or South America up to our border, where are the logistics? I've never seen anything like this. I mean, they're apprehending 1,000 a day in just one sector.
Yes. Now, let's kind of go back to the Iraq model here, maybe, or to the Afghanistan model, or even to the Syria model. We have all of these temporary detention facilities, and I only call them detention or housing facilities, whatever you want to call them, that we've had to, I mean, we're financially breaking the Department of Homeland Security to do this, because we weren't built for these kinds of numbers. But Jason, help me. Why are we not taking a stand right now? Because, I mean, we obviously did it in coordination with USAID and whatnot in Syria and Turkey and Lebanon and blah, 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 blah for the refugees. We know how to do that. We have these safe zones. So why aren't we constructing safe zones in Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, even Mexico? Help me with that.
Well, that's one thing I always talk about. I'm like, look, we have, if you combine the Central American countries and Mexico, we have 17 consulate offices down there. Perhaps an executive order saying we're going to forward deploy immigration judges and asylum officers down to these areas, and that people are going to have to apply for asylum at one of these 17 locations rather than coming into or through the U.S. border. It makes no sense that everything has to happen at a port of entry or at our border when we have all these locations down south.
Yeah. So how come you haven't made that happen?
I've talked about it a million times.
What's the resistance? I mean, what is really the whole resistance of addressing this issue? Because at this point, it's going to sound nuts, but why don't we just go buy the entire country of El Salvador and be done with it? Just call it, a U.S. property.
If it was that easy, But the thing is, that whole area is a corridor, and that comes away from like Brazil and even and further south. Is a lot of people don't realize that other countries, Ethiopia, Yemen, anybody flies in. A lot of times what they do is they transit in from Dubai to Brazil, and they travel up these same smuggling corridors as everybody else does. So, I mean, everything and anybody is coming through the southwest border. So it's not just, Latin America. It's everybody and anybody.
Right. But, if they want something, safer than being in Cote d'Ivoire or Congo, we give them a reason to, if you're going to make your way into, we've got 1 or 2% of Honduras has left the country.
Yeah.
That's a lot of people. So we give them a reason to stay.
Well, yeah, we do, because what happens is ICE is only mandated to have I think it was like 40 or 50,000 bed spaces, meaning you could house people. And it used to be under Obama, 34,000. But when you have 100,000 migrants coming across in 1 month, and how many of them claim asylum, and then, either it gets refused or they get a court hearing, they're just released into the interior of the country. There is no detention facilities that are going to take, up to 1 million people a year to house. And if you're looking, and a lot of people don't realize, to house one person per day can be anywhere from, $17 to over $100. So that's 1 day for housing.
But we haven't, we haven't talked about medical. We haven't talked about clothing. We haven't talked about, food. We haven't talked about education. We haven't talked about transportation. We haven't talked about,
and my thing is, a lot of it is the draw to get here before the immigration reform is passed or any sort of immigration law is passed. And my whole thing has always been, hey, let's piecemeal immigration. We don't need an 1,100-page document to figure out what's wrong with the immigration system. We need to look at it, just chop it up and say, okay, you know what? Let's talk about asylum today. We'll talk about something else tomorrow. And, oh, by the way, why don't we pull into the people that actually know what's going on at the border? And we're not talking just the enforcement aspects. Talk to these asylum officers. Talk to these people that work for citizenship and immigration services at the field level and find out what the real deal is. Because you know as well as I do that anybody in the upper levels of management don't know what the ground truth is. So you need to pull in these people and find out what the ground truth is.
If you were to give a congressional hearing before, the Senate or the House and whatever cockamamie committee it could be several committees, what is your real message going to be?
Well, absent immigration reform, which isn't going to happen anytime soon.
Correct. It ain't going to happen.
I would say pass a measure where we need to hire those 10,000 bodies that were promised, 10,000 officers, special agents, support staff. And, you don't need just enforcement. You don't need just reactive officers to go out and apprehend people. You need special agents with Homeland Security or with other agencies that could disrupt and dismantle these smuggling organizations. Because there is no way you're pushing that many bodies through Mexico without a smuggling organization being involved with it. There's no way.
Dr. Jason, here's the deal. The monies that is being sent, I think a lot of it is coming from the United States, from distant family members or friends or even NGOs, the Catholic charities, the church organizations, and it's being remitted to entities in, I would imagine, several methods. You can pay that stuff through Facebook, for crying out loud, in direct and so then those monies are actually going to the smugglers, which I would argue many of them are actually cartel members because they've altered their business model, right?
Yeah. Well, think about it. If right now the optics and everything down south is get to the United States before we pass immigration reform. The smugglers are looking at that going, okay, well, if we charge $5,000 to $10,000 a person and we're looking at 1 million people a year, we're talking multi-billion-dollar a year business.
Yeah.
Why smuggle dope and everything else when you can smuggle people to supplement their income? I mean, granted, they're still smuggling narcotics, but now they're becoming billionaires off of human trafficking and human smuggling.
Back during the Obama administration, Jason, I remember doing a radio show mentioning a topic where some of these sponsors here in the United States that are taking some of these unaccompanied children were actually being put into slave labor on farms, picking, strawberries or whatever it may have been. And or the other ones were actually going into the whole sex trade, pornography trade. And yet nobody seemed to, here in the United States, ring the alarm bell on that one. And that was, I know that had to be 6 or 7 years ago.
Yeah, it was actually 2015, and I actually blew the whistle on that. That's what my whistleblowing was about. I was part of Obama's human smuggling cell. I work with a whole bunch of DHS entities, and I found out that the government was releasing these kids to sex offenders and criminals.
Yeah.
And so I blew the whistle on it, and it didn't go anywhere. Media-wise, didn't go anywhere. There's a spattering of news articles. I did go to Senator Grassley's office eventually, and they actually ran with it to start vetting these sponsors. And he's the one that brought to light about these the labor trafficking and a lot of these kids and really ending up in really bad areas.
Yes.
And the reason I blew the whistle was because I'm like, as soon as I found out we were releasing criminals, I said we really need to get these kids back, and it just went, it went on deaf ears.
So,
and
go ahead.
It's just frustrating.
Yes. So I would say when it comes to these sponsors, whoever they may be, I mean, I can imagine the list is probably in the hundreds, if not in the thousands, that we, knock on the door of the IRS and move their nonprofit status.
Yeah, well, a lot of the sponsors, and that's the thing, is it's this whole cycle of how the kids get to the sponsors. And these sponsors, they can come in, they were coming in, grabbing the kids, claiming them, but they weren't having any criminal histories done, no fingerprints, no background, nothing. Now, that is why we're having an issue with the border now, because you're having a lot of adults saying they're family members, but the administration is saying, you know what, we have to do rapid DNA analysis to determine if you really are. And I think they did a sampling in the Rio Grande Valley that 30% of the adults saying that they're with the kids are not the family members. So, I mean, and that's another aspect. If I got in front of Congress, I'd say, look, if someone comes in this country with a child and claims to a federal official that child is theirs, and they end up lying about it, we charge them with 1001, lying to a federal official, and then we get them for alien smuggling as well. So, I mean, there has to be something we could do legally to stop these people from using children as pawns. And that's the thing, is these smuggling organizations use children as a commodity. How many times are they using these kids to bring adults back and forth?
Yeah. I can't even imagine the numbers. I mean, I really just cannot imagine the numbers. And I would say, there ought to be a full page ad in every single newspaper that the Democrats are fine and ignoring the smuggling aspect of these kids that are essentially being rented, and they're being sponsored by sex offenders or by slave labor. So why are we not fighting back? I mean, I don't see the right kind of arguments happening on all this. Jason, am I overthinking it?
No, you're not overthinking it. It's just that everybody's right now, everybody wants to run to the border. They want to do a 5-minute photo op, and then they want to go back to, yelling in Congress or whatever they're doing. And, both sides can be guilty of doing the same thing.
Oh,
but
yeah.
You need to get down to that border. You need to go there at 2 a.m. in the morning, somewhere where the border's open, which, a ton of that 2,000 miles of border is open, and just watch what comes across. And it's not all families. It's not all, people coming here for the betterment. There is some really bad, evil people in that border. And that's why I always tell people, I'm like, it's a bloody and dangerous area for a reason. It's because there's bandits down there, there's smugglers, there's everything you can imagine. It's not, hunky-dory, we're coming into the port of entry after we just, walked 5 miles.
Let's talk about the health issue a little bit, because it was during the Obama administration, we went through an Ebola panic where we sent U.S. military over to, a handful of countries in Africa. We were, isolating these towns, these encampments. We were sending in the Center for Disease Control. We were, stopping planes and, doing all of these things. But what happens? Well, I see the federal government, we only react to something. We're not proactive. And so I haven't seen anybody mention the fact that, we are having diseases already that have been eradicated here in the United States, and we're seeing an emergence of some of them. We went through this whole inoculation scandal for the measles thing, but nobody's talking about some of these other diseases, necessarily Ebola.
Well, it could be anything. And that's what I was mentioning before about every country comes through that southwest border. It's not just Latin America and, Central and South America. And so when this initially happened and they said they were deploying the military down there, I was one of the first that said, yeah, sure, do it. And what you do is you send out a division of medical personnel to screen, working in coordination with CDC, to screen every single migrant that comes across. Because you know what? You just don't know. If you're in a group of 10,000 people, let's say you're part of this caravan, and one person gets something, regardless of where they're from, they could spread that to someone else. Let's say if it's an airborne or fluid, it gets in there. So you just don't know. So you need to screen the whole. You're not coming in little piecemeal groups. You're coming as a whole, that everybody needs to be screened. Whether or not that's happening, I don't think so. And if it is, it's just a tertiary screening.
Southern Command, I believe, probably has more interaction with what is happening in Central America and even Latin America. And I don't see a lot of people calling on the leadership of Southern Command to weigh in on this problem. Is that because somebody's afraid that we're going to politicize, we're going to force the Pentagon and Southern Command to be politicized in this whole argument?
I think it could be two factors. You could look at it as politicized, or you're going to actually find something.
Yes. And
what happens if you find something,
Well, I know the data is there. This isn't a new, condition for us. We've been at this 40 or 50 years.
Yeah, I was hired in the Border Patrol in 2000. That's one thing I've been in and out of DHS for, 16, 17 years, and worked for DOD and a bunch of other agencies. So I've kind of been around the block with that whole southwest border and everything going on down there. And the 90s was the big push. And a lot of people don't realize that Clinton started the whole fences and gates and walls.
Yeah.
Operation Gatekeeper, San Diego. It was a 14-mile stretch from the Pacific Ocean through San Diego up to the Otay Mountains. And what that did was it curbed all the traffic to the east. And people were like, well, that just pushed the traffic away. But a
barrier worked.
Yeah. But if you go and you look at the suburbs of San Diego now, there's a town called Chula Vista which, at one time only had older homes and everything. But since that wall went up, they put up thousands of homes, malls, schools. The economy just went through the roof, and it still is to this day. It's just, so what happens is the wall pushed the traffic. So now you're not having, hundreds of bodies a night running through neighborhoods when nobody wants to buy a house. Now the traffic moved, and now you have agents on the border there moving that traffic. So I'm a proponent of walls in one aspect, because what it does is it funnels traffic to certain areas.
Mm-hmm.
You can't put a 2,000-mile wall up. It won't work. But if you do funnel traffic, that's where you could put your technology. That's where you could put your boots on the ground to make the apprehensions. So that's kind of where I'm at when it comes to walls and, how the 90s worked.
Well, I don't disagree with that one. I mean, you're going to find the path of least resistance. And if there's some kind of a barrier there, some kind of a structure, you're going to go, okay, well, I'll walk another, 10 miles to the left or 10 miles to the right, and surely there won't be some kind of a barrier. So you automatically are reducing the linear footage of what you have to cover, right?
Yeah, and let's say we have 16,000 plus Border Patrol agents to cover 2,000 miles. Now that's a 24/7, 365 operation. So you just don't have enough agents to cover that whole area. Because, what if an agent goes on leave, they get sick, and now you have, quit. And that's oh man, we can go into manpower and how much, the attrition is 750 plus a year just for the Border Patrol. But that's the thing, is that you need something to alleviate the pressure. You just can't have an open, porous border, because technology works great if it works. Cloud covering, sensors go offline. It just doesn't work 100% of the time.
I'm also concerned that we're not seeing any raids here, in the inner part of the country, where we have these deportations going on. I mean, we used to do, 4 or 5 months ago, we were doing some of these raids, and we were going into meat factories, and we were, grabbing 60 or 70 people, whatever the number is, we're not seeing that. And that tells me that those resources that were doing these operations inside the homeland have been yanked from there to go cover, be the Uber drivers and doing the diaper runs, right?
Yeah, and that's what happens right now. Is a lot of people don't realize that ICE as a whole does 40% immigration, and all enforcement removal operations does is immigration. But they have a whole other branch, Homeland Security investigations, which are the ones that are supposed to be taking out these smuggling organizations, whether it be arms, narcotics, people, child pornography, and everything else, and worksite enforcement, which are the I-9 inspections. But right now, those resources are getting deployed to the southwest border.
Yes.
Not to go after smuggling organizations, not to disrupt and dismantle, the Chapo Guzmans or everybody else that was involved with everything. They're just down there to do regular officer work. And the thing is, you're not going to have the interior enforcement anymore. You're going to have all these men and women taken out of doing, let's say, child exploitation investigations, money laundering, sent down just to do daycare.
So precisely. So then that puts the burden on local law enforcement and then FBI, right?
And then what are you going to do with local law enforcement when they have a pact where they're not allowed to work with ICE and they have sanctuary?
Yeah.
And FBI, I cannot see an FBI agent going out and doing worksite enforcement or checking I-9s either. And then, oh, by the way, we have an election coming up. So what that means is you're going to have to task, let's say, 800 to 1,000 HSI agents just to do protection detail for candidates. That's the other people don't realize. That when a Secret Service gets tasked with these elections, yeah.
So we're out of bodies. We're virtually out of bodies.
And by the time you hire new bodies, if you could find new bodies that could pass the whole system, they still have to make it through the HR process.
Mm-hmm.
The HR process can take anywhere from 6 months to a year because, yeah, by the way, you could contract out hiring and all that, but you still need HR staff. And that's the other thing is people want to hire special agents, but when for every 10 special agents you hire, or let's say every 20 or 30 special agents you hire an HR person because you need to process these bodies to get them into the system. That's what takes such a long time to get special agents' boots on the ground. And then you got to train them. I mean, just because you go to an 11, 20-week school doesn't mean you really know what you're doing until you actually get on the ground. So, yeah, it's exciting stuff, huh?
I mean, just to go through a line-by-line budget and then compare that to the line-by-line real-time expenditures reported each month, that into itself ought to be a PowerPoint presentation that goes into a whole 8-week TV documentary, right?
Rather than, I tell people all the time, I'm like, just put me in front of Congress. I'll talk all day long.
I'll help you. I'll feed you notes like crazy.
I'm usually straight down the line. I'm like, this is the reality, and you got to do something about it because it's not going to stop.
Well, we're clearly not going to get any kind of immigration reform. It just isn't going to happen. I mean, I would see that, in the Gang of Eight out of the Senate, they passed that. I think it's actually time to dust that off and start pulling out the pieces in it that, had some viability to it and start amending it. Now, I'm not sure I see anybody on the Senate side doing that kind of thing. But
no. Who wants to touch immigration when you have an election?
No, exactly. I mean, ladies and gentlemen, we are speaking with Dr. Jason Piccolo, who was a former special agent supervisor with the Department of Homeland Security. He did the whole trafficking corridors, San Diego, the Mexican border, narco smuggling, unaccompanied alien kids, criminals, sex offenders, all those kinds of things. And he's the author of Unwavering, which, by the way, you can find on Amazon.com. Which I would think at this point you ought to be in the middle of your next book, right?
I am, actually.
See?
Yep.
And that's due out when?
I might just finish it. No, I'm just kidding. After this one, it'll be done. I'm trying to get it done by November.
Oh.
So I write pretty quick.
Okay. Well, good to know. Good to know. Well, on the other side, we're going to have Jason hang with us because I've got some other entities or other lanes that we need to speak of when it comes to whistleblower and immigration because I think what we've covered, while it's a deck chair off the Titanic, there's more that needs to be addressed. So, ladies and gentlemen, hang with us, and we'll be back shortly.
The truth. The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman. Seat over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder. Seat out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Suppress, Mike Charlie, 435 9er 21, grid to Mark, Mike Charlie, 47 tree 9er, 89er, out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck, 2 rounds HEPT, gas TOT 53.
And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
And thanks for hanging with us, ladies and gentlemen, on the Denise Simon Experience. We've been having a fascinating conversation with Dr. Jason Piccolo, who was a former special agent and supervisor with the Department of Homeland Security, and he did his time as a Border Patrol agent, supervisor on the whole narco smuggling organizations, which I bet you had a great time reading some of the text on the El Chapo Guzman trial. But we've been discussing the other piece parts to immigration. But now I want to ask you, Mr. Jason, in the military, as you well know, we use a lot of government contractors. We were using things like DynCorp and Triple Canopy and, all those. Why are we not doing that with the Department of Homeland Security? And we go these contractors know what to do. Go put them on that border to help out Border Patrol.
Well, that's one thing we could do to alleviate. Let's say we don't even want to use, there are so many support aspects to that border, whether it's fueling up generators that put the lights on a border, whether it's transporting aliens to and from, or just even processing, searching. There are a ton of areas where you could use contracted forces. Getting them through, it's a government contract at this point in the game, and then trying to get government to fund that contract. Because how much do you think it's going to cost to outsource that to not a Triple Canopy or anywhere? I mean, if you're looking at a multi-million or even close to, tens of millions to put resources on a border, who's going to fund it?
Well, it's just a minor detail. I mean, suspend the money going to Planned Parenthood and put it over there with DynCorp.
And that's the thing. If it was only easy to just transfer that. Well, you know what? You brought up a good point, a great point. Because look what's happening right now. Right now we were talking about in the first half of the show, you have enforcement removal operations and Homeland Security investigations. They both work off the same pot of money. So what's happening right now is you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. Because ERO is taking all of HSI's money. So let's say you need to give $80 million as a yearly budget for like a computer crimes or something like that. And all of a sudden it gets knocked down to like, $5 or $6 million, and all that money is going to housing aliens. So right now, instead of doing like child exploitation and child pornography online investigations, you're housing aliens. So you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. I mean, it's just this huge, this budgeting thing right now at the border is just way more than just housing bodies. You're taking everything from all these other resources and throwing it at the border.
We have look, we've got the Meredith Initiative, we've got USAID, we've got the Millennium Challenge. I mean, we've got all these other cockamamie funds that the Congress has, I call them slush funds. And the one big one is the Community Reinvestment Act. Well, I would shut down the cockamamie Community Reinvestment Act or the Export-Import Bank. And I think you can, I'd have to check with all the legal beagles that I deal with all the time, on a suspension basis, 18 months, for instance, and reassign those dollars and go sign a contract with DynCorp. Does that sound like a logical thing to do, unless you get the ACLU that gets their, knickers in a knock?
Well, there are people that could do we're already contracted out transportation. I mean, ICE was doing that for years before this, and that would alleviate so much. And then you have, just watching, just regular patrol. We're not talking about making apprehensions. We're just talking about, basic guard duty.
Yeah.
So it's not like you have to go and, hire people to go and make arrests and,
right,
teach them use of force. We're talking about just general guard duty.
Yeah.
And then find facilities where we could house up to 100,000 people.
Well, I guess I'm the kind of saying we've created these communities out of tents all along the border to house these people. So we're just going to take the money out of going to Chicago or, and move it down to there. So it's just like, sorry, Chicago, but this is, we're just, using the same fund. We're just going to concentrate in a different spot. I mean, that's a $2.4 billion fund, the Community Reinvestment Act.
Yeah, it's crazy. Well, let's talk about money. Right now, we have 412 immigration judges, 420. And right now, we have a backlog of over 800,000 current cases that are backlogged, not including this 1 million plus are going to come in over the next year. So we need to hire immigration judges. We need to pool money right now to hire at least 100 or more immigration judges. Because without immigration judges, you can't adjudicate these immigration claims when they get to the court. And on top of that, we need to hire 1,000 more asylum officers.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, there's not just a whole enforcement aspect. I mean, and DOJ is the one, and DOJ has their own separate funding, and immigration judges are part of the Department of Justice. So that's one simple, I mean, and that's not even trying to fix the whole thing. That's just saying, hey, you know what? Tomorrow morning, we're going to put on USA Jobs to hire 100 immigration judges. If you have the background in it, let's just do it. Do an expedited hiring, get them down to the border, and start processing. Start getting through these immigration backlog. And if you need to hire more than 100, hire 400, double the capacity. Because right now, then, if you start showing people that their claims, if they have illegitimate claims and they're going to get removed back to their country or ordered removed, that's going to happen, it's going to show people that they're not going to just come here and get a free ride because they know that they're never going to see a judge. And if they do, all they have to do is appeal it, and they're going to be here for at least 5 or 6 years.
I say we go over to the State Department and take some money that goes to Cambodia and say, we're going to have to suspend this. We're going to have to, move some of this money over to, the border or Honduras. You know what I mean? I mean, I just know that there are other creative things that we can do. I mean, when you're moving 1 million pounds of humanitarian goods into crazy locations, those humanitarian goods need to, go to the border patrol so they're not running around getting diapers and cereal and, all that other kind of stuff. But that's just me. Let me switch gears here because there's so many other components that they're not really being discussed, and that's chain migration. That is visa overstays, and that's visa fraud. Why are we just kind of ignoring those things because the volume at the southern border is across the Rubicon?
Yeah, there's way too much going on right now, especially in the immigration world. And every resource is pooled to the southern border because the same Homeland Security investigations are the ones that are due the visa overstays and the visa fraud. So does Citizenship and Immigration Services. Everybody's pulled at the border when they should be focusing on, gosh, I don't even know where to start. Sometimes when you think about it, it's just such a broken system right now.
We have all these other organizations too that are in part of government, these other, I guess maybe we ought to be asking for volunteers, because I guarantee you there's a whole bunch of people here in the United States, a whole bunch of citizens that are freaked out about really what is happening, that don't have anything else to do and would rather jump in and try and help out, even if it's for a stipend or just volunteering. So, I mean, little old me, I'd be happy to, dedicate 3 hours a day to just doing data entry or, going and researching something or other, or looking up some kind of database. I mean, is there some kind of a volunteer system that you're aware of that we could mobilize to help out here if there's not any money?
No, there's not.
I
Unfortunately,
don't like
because
any of your answers. You know that?
well, you're talking about the government, and what happens is,
I know.
think about, well, you know what this should be, because think about when they mobilized for the census.
Yeah.
And you're doing basically the same thing: data entry, basic interviewing,
Yeah.
biographical interviewing, and there's a lot of field work you could do. But then you just got to think about, what entails hiring someone to be part of the government, even if it is just voluntary. Does that include disability benefits? Let's say you fall and you get hurt.
Not on a volunteer
Does
basis.
that include
We don't want to mess up their Medicare.
Yeah, and that's so in a perfect world, yes, there are ways to help, but not when it comes to the federal government. And that's one of these things where we're like, hey, you know what? Let's go talk about it and find out solutions. And that is one thing that bothers the heck out of me, because on top of everything, I've done in my career, I was also an infantry officer and captain.
I know you are. Yeah.
And I know, like in the military, you just make things happen. When we deployed, I was over in Kuwait, and then we had to change a mission and said we got to go north. You just roll with it and you change it. You make things happen. But now you just cannot. I say, sit down and make things happen. You can call it the art of the deal or the art of the squeal or whatever you want, but let's just make it happen. It's not hard to sit down with people as human beings and just have a solution. And it drives me nuts when everything becomes this big political quagmire. Like, I'm not going to get elected if I want to do the right thing.
Tell me one of your most remarkable stories about being a narco agent person.
Jeez.
Give me one. Give me a good one.
Oh, you want to know the reality of the border? Is we had a source that gave us a guy coming across. He had 8 pounds of coke, and we knew he was going to drop it off, and he was going to get picked up and go somewhere else. So we're down in San Diego. We were following this guy out. We had perfect surveillance on him. We could have followed him all the way from San Diego to, New York. He never would have found us out. But we all got called back to the station.
Oh, stop!
Well, first we were told to take the target down, and then we got called back because we had a mandatory meeting.
Stop it!
And I'm like, yeah. So we took him down, brought him back, ended up flipping him. Meeting got canceled. We followed him. We followed him back out. He worked for us now. He dropped off the vehicle. Bad guy came to pick up the vehicle, brought it back to his apartment to unload it. When we took him down, we found 280 keys of coke. So a mandatory meeting almost took us away from that. So, I mean, it's just...
And you're full of those stories, I bet, right?
Yeah, but, every week was either a 5, 10, 20,000 pound weed load, like marijuana. Every week there was cocaine loads. So, I mean, that's just the stuff that we picked off. I mean, the border is just, it's like the Wild West. People, unless you've been there and you actually worked it. And that's one thing I like to tell people. I'm like, look, I was a Border Patrol agent in San Diego. And I patrolled those same areas that I went to work as a special agent. And I never had an idea what was going on around me as a Border Patrol agent.
So if you didn't, how could we?
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, you need to talk to the people that are working this stuff now. Kidnappings, gangs, drugs. It's all happening day to day, 24/7. So you need to talk to those people.
The smuggling thing. I get emails every day from the FBI on cases that they've handled. Who's gone to jail, who's doing this, who's doing that. I bet you I get 20 or 30 of them a day. And what's really kind of fascinating is the majority of these emails from the FBI. So the majority of the cases that they're sending out an email about happens to be illegal smuggling. We don't have a concept of how big that problem really is, do we?
No, because, oh my gosh. Think about cocaine. Every town in our country has cocaine in it. How much supply do you need for that demand? And how much are we really getting? Once in a while you hear the Coast Guard picks off a 2-ton cocaine load. But what is 2 tons? Is that a week in New York? You know what I mean?
Yes.
Seriously. And how much is getting through? Whether it's tunnel, cargo, backpackers, whatever, how much is getting through? And until you disrupt and dismantle these organizations, it's always going to come through.
Okay, so we handled Guzman, but we don't hear anything about any of these other cartels here. It's kind of like we handled the Guzman Sinaloa thing, but we didn't handle the Sinaloa thing. We just handled him. But nobody's talking about, we used to know the names of several of them. And nobody talks about them. Yes.
They're smart because, the AFO, the Ariana Felix guys, you'd hear about them all the time. Everybody knew about the AFO. The Zetas. Now I don't know the names of, we could probably call up some friends and find out who the main smugglers are, but are they really the main smugglers anymore? They don't have that notoriety. Chapo was notorious for, 2 decades for a reason. And now the trafficking's going on, cartels are working, but we don't have this big, wanted dead or alive posters or just wanted posters anywhere.
Remarkable, isn't it?
Have you heard of indictment of any major?
No, that's my point. I haven't seen an indictment. I watched that Guzman case pretty closely. I haven't seen any ICE raids in Nashville, Tennessee. All of a sudden, a lot of this chatter of these activities has stopped, and that just tells me either we're not hearing about it and it's still going on, or it's not going on at all, that there's nothing to talk about because all these resources have been sent south. In the meantime, I would say that we are abusing still the whole chain migration thing and the visa overstays and visa fraud that nobody's really speaking of.
No, and that's the thing is everything happens day to day, but it's not in the news. It's not in the spotlight. Try to find the information. It's tough to find actual investigative reporting anymore where you're finding out real information. It's not just all the same bullets in the same newspapers all across the country. So even as a layman just trying to find out what's really going on in our country, you can't find it.
Well, Mexico killed all the journalists. There aren't any journalists anymore, right?
No.
And the mayors and the law enforcement.
Yeah.
So when are you holding this hearing, or are we just doing radio as you're hearing?
I am. I'm actually just talking. I'm always just. I'm done with the whistleblower stuff.
Why? Don't be. We need that back.
Oh no, I'm done whistleblowing. I don't have anything to blow the whistle on, so I'm just out there speaking my mind. And kind of trying to give as much ground truth as I can. Because I still have a ton of friends that are in and out of ICE and other agencies. So just out there talking. I'm ready to go to Congress. Let's go.
Yeah, I want to do some combat work here with Congress, for sure. When you're out there speaking, you have anybody in your audience that's out there saying, yeah, but, and they want to, be argumentative with you?
No, not at all. I usually just do the rounds on mainstream media and other podcasts, radio. I haven't really had anybody say, hey, why or what. And I'd always say, hey, you know what, let's talk about it.
Well, if there's something that's keeping you up at night, Mr. Jason, what is it?
Oh, it's that border. It's just, I'd love to know everything that comes through that border, whether it's the tunnels or, what's coming over it, or what are we letting slip through.
The attitude, the morale for Border Patrol has to be horrible. Horrible.
Yeah, I had a thing. I called the border burnout. You've been out there for 3 to 5 years. You take the job because you want to do the right thing. You want a career. You like having the idea of, protecting our nation. But you go down to the border and you find out you're living in an austere environment. You're trying to, if you do want to raise a family, there's no good schools nearby. It takes you an hour to get groceries. And you don't have the support of the country behind you. I mean, you do have half of it. But the other half is like, they look at you as a devil. So yeah, morale is pretty tough. But you do have the administration behind you, which is something I didn't see before.
Sure. If we really took on this whole thing, let's just say with the drug cartels, and we went on to this one full force, would we bring down about half the government of Mexico?
Oh, I'm sure. And if you ever want to stop, remember when Kiki Camarena got killed?
Oh, I do.
They shut the border for a couple of days, and then
Yes.
all of a sudden, your suspects are at the doorstep of the U.S. government. Maybe shutting the border down for a few days to figure out how we're going to stop this migration might be a good thing to do.
Well, I think between ICE, DEA, ATF, Border Patrol, we need a big win here. I mean, we need a morale boost, and I don't see one on the horizon. I'm a little fretful, a lot fretful over that. I mean, we need a big, huge win. When we see that there was some kind of an ICE raid in, St. Louis, and we got 200 people, that's a yippee skippy moment, but we're not seeing any of those. We need a shot in the arm, and I don't see one on the horizon. Do you?
No, I don't, because let's say you do have all the subject matter expert worksite enforcement special agents, and you're sending them to the southwest border because they are experts at that. Mm-hmm. Who's going to go and do these I-9 checks, these worksite enforcement raids in the interior? It just won't happen.
It's a bleak picture.
Very positive conversation.
Well, we what you called it, the ground truth.
That's what it is.
Yeah, I have a buddy of mine.
Hashtag ground truth.
That's right. That's precisely right. I have a buddy of mine who's former CIA, and he does a podcast that he calls the ground truth. So I kind of like that one. But big, huge thanks to Jason Piccolo, author of Unwavering, and he's in the middle of his next book. So congratulations on that one. Thanks for being with us and explaining all of this. We do want the ground truth. We do want to know how it really is. And, I'm always one of these that if they're not talking about it, there's a reason they're not talking about it. And I'm concerned about that whole part. But thanks for being with us. You're always welcome back. If you want to go on a segment rant, you're welcome to do that. So big thank you to you. And ladies and gentlemen, there's more coming your way. So stay with us. And thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for staying with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. President Trump is in Europe. He he kind of left a wake of a little bit of chaos in Washington, D.C., dealing with tariffs in Mexico. So I reached out to the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and they were so kind to offer up Brian Young, who is a senior fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I think he's a financial consequence guy. He's been cited all over the place with his good work, and he's been kind enough to join us. So thank you, Mr. Ryan, for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience.
Thanks for having me, Denise.
I'm not convinced that we're really going to have these building tariffs on Mexico as a consequence of immigration. I think it was a shot across the bow. What are your thoughts? What's the chatter in Washington, D.C.?
I think you're right. I think there are more than one factors involved. Immigration is one of them, and it was the main thrust of the administration's official statements when it announced the tariffs. But they also mentioned trade and wanting U.S. companies to locate more often in the U.S. and to do more of their manufacturing and assembly work in the U.S. So immigration is not the sole concern here. But what it also is doing, and here's where I question whether the left hand knows what the right hand is doing at the administration, it's really placing an existential threat on the new NAFTA USMCA trade agreement that the administration has been working on almost since its inception.
Well, yeah, I mean, it kind of complicates things and gives a reason for the House or for Congress not to even take up the new NAFTA measure, correct?
Yeah, to date, the single biggest holdup was the 25% steel and 10% aluminum tariffs that had been placed against Mexico and Canada for national security reasons. As soon as Trump withdrew those about 3 weeks ago, things started moving. Both Canada and Mexico made moves to introduce the agreement to their legislatures for ratification votes. In fact, Mexican President Lopez Obrador asked his country's Senate, which is out of session until September, to hold a special session just to ratify the agreement. And then within hours of that happening, the administration announced the new Mexico tariff threat. Whether the administration goes through with it or not remains to be seen. So the administration does have an easy out if it wants to take it. But that shot across the bow really threatens the agreement's future.
That's an interesting little detail. I had not even considered that. Respectfully, Canada and Mexico hadn't even taken up the new trade agreement. So we can't completely blame everything on our own Congress, can we?
No, it's the three-country agreement, and all three countries have long processes to ratify it. It's been about 6 months since the three leaders of the countries have ratified the agreement.
Yeah.
But all three legislatures have yet to act, including ours. And in fact, there's another development here in the U.S. There's a two-step process where President Trump announces an administrative intent, which opens a 30-day waiting period. When that's over, then President Trump can send the agreement to our Congress. The other countries apparently have less cumbersome procedures, but that's how ours works. President Trump announced his 30-day window was opening about 12 hours before he announced the Mexico tariffs. So that was another big surprise. And apparently, Bob Lighthizer, his top trade advisor, had no idea this was coming, and he was unhappy, reportedly.
You might be part of the legal Beagle team on this too, but can a president just impose a tariff, or all tariffs really have to go through a legislative process?
It used to be all legislative because under the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, all taxing power goes with Congress. Anything that raises revenue has to come from Congress. Back in the 60s and 70s, Congress delegated away some of that authority to the president. They found all kinds of intra-party bickering and special interest vote trading and buying, and that sort of thing was happening with Congress setting tariff policy. So they decided that the president, being a single figure that represents the nation as a whole, rather than parochial constituencies, would be less prone to, the special interest conflicts. So they decided to give the president some tariff setting authority. But that's rarely been used until this administration. And with these Mexico tariffs, in fact, the The president cited a third bill, which has never been used to raise a tariff. So this would make a fresh judicial precedent, and nobody knows what's going to happen if the president goes through with the tariff and it ends up becoming a court case.
So, Mexico, we're hearing some rumors that Mexico has got quite an envoy that began arriving in the United States, I think last Sunday, and some talks are in earnest happening this week. But the other part of the rumor is that they have stepped up their game a little bit here on immigration. Is there any truth to that you've heard?
Yeah, the president said that he would stop the Mexico tariffs if Mexico addresses its immigration policies and lets fewer people through the borders. The trouble is that he didn't give them any specific benchmarks or goals for them to measure against. So it's more discretion than it is actually meeting an objective, which I don't think was a good strategic move on our administration's part, because it doesn't give Mexico evidence that we're negotiating with them in good faith on these tariffs. So what Mexico's delegation is doing right now, and you're right that they were sent within hours of the tariff being announced, is that they're trying to convince the administration right now that they already have taken substantial steps and that they're going to take more. The trouble is that these kinds of policies will take months to implement, and the tariff would begin to take effect in 5 days, which is another not good faith move that might sour both our relations with Mexico in general as well as the USMCA agreement that the president has stated several times is his top legislative agenda item.
Is Mexico and or Canada's economic landscape pretty good? I mean, is it stabilized? Is it growing? Do you have some kind of sense of that?
They are. In fact, ironically, the immigration issue gives us some evidence. Immigration from Mexico and Latin America tends to spike when times are bad, and it tends to go down when times are good. If times are good, there's no incentive for people to move. And immigration as a whole, especially from Mexico, has been down sharply since about 2010. It's at its lowest levels in more than a decade. So that's a sign of good times, as well as something that the administration wants to accomplish as far as its agenda goes.
And Canada seems to be running as a well-oiled machine. Is that right?
Yeah, the trouble with Canada is that our steel imports by far come largely from Canada. The U.S. makes most of its own supply, but as far as our imports go, Canada is our biggest exporter. So they're doing healthy, but of course the steel tariffs obviously upset them and also upset some of their supply chains, caused some economic shocks, and there's been some controversy over dairy policy, which frankly Canada could stand to improve on their end.
Yeah.
And that's partially addressed in the USMCA agreement. So if that gets torpedoed, that's another Trump administration objective that would go down with it.
Do you have a sense, Ryan, that for the sake of argument, the tariffs are happening? Do you have a sense of what the actual dollar amount may be of that 5% each month?
Well, annually we export just under $350 billion from Mexico per year. They're our third largest trading partner. Canada's the biggest. I think China's number 2. Japan is also on the short list, but $350 billion. So take 5% of that, and then the prorated for the first month, 10% for the second month, 15 on up to 25, effective October 1. Should it go that far? And not only will it raise a substantial amount in taxes that American consumers will pay in the form of higher prices, but it'll also reduce the number of imports that we take in. So it'll raise less revenue than the administration is probably hoping it will.
There was some chatter that Trump was going to. I mean, let's say it equates to $500 million a month. What happens to that money? I mean, does that go into Treasury? does that help subsidize farmers, or is there some kind of history or pattern on what we do with those tariff fines, if you will?
Yes, tariffs go directly to the United States Treasury. They're not earmarked for anything special. They just go to the Treasury, and then the government can disperse them as it pleases. So they're not tied to farm aid or anything else to counteract the negative effects of the tariffs. They just go into the Treasury.
Mm-hmm. But in this particular case, I mean, because we got two sectors. We got manufacturing and we've got agriculture that really would be a part of the consequence here. So it may kind of help offset some of the financial damage. Would that be right?
It's like fixing two wrongs, or it's trying to make two wrongs make a right. For soybean farmers, they've seen demand collapse by about 3/4 for our exports, and most U.S. soybeans are exported. And at the same time as they're seeing their sales crash, they're seeing farm equipment prices go up because of the steel and aluminum tariffs, which are apparently now coming back. They've been gone for 2 weeks, but apparently now they're going to come back and then some. So we'll see how that goes with farmers. So again, two wrongs don't always make a right.
You really are kind of a consequence guy here, because I mean you have to kind of look at a very wide spectrum when it comes to these kind of tariffs and regulations, right?
Yeah, and you also have to look at it from political strategy. Every time the Trump administration has enacted a new tariff, it's not resulted in the kind of reforms that the Trump administration wants. And I happen to favor many of those same reforms. So in some sense, we're on the same page here. The trouble is that that's not how other countries respond. They retaliate with their own tariffs, not with what we intend them to do. And this has happened time and again in country after country. And we'll likely see that again in some form with these Mexican tariffs. Mexico's not going to implement the reforms we want them to. They're going to retaliate with something that we do not like, and that will hurt the American economy.
Well, we're certainly seeing that with China. They're pulling out all kinds of things here that they want to punish the United States over, right?
Yeah, and a fair amount of it is informal. It can range from things just holding things up for no reason in ports, making things more difficult, and adding conditions and under-the-table levies for businesses that want to do business in China. Some of the stuff is so under the table it can't be measured, and it makes it harder to remove when hopefully relations improve in the future. And that kind of damage is particularly pernicious just because it's so hard to keep track of and so hard to reform.
I guess when it comes to these tariffs, Trump is also necessarily sending a shot across the bow to Congress because they're not acting on immigration policy. So is this a two-track threat that you're seeing?
Yes, but I question how coherent it is, because even though the Mexican tariffs are mainly justified in terms of wanting to spur immigration reform, they're also going to torpedo a trade agreement. So in a way, he's going to choose one or the other.
Yeah.
And he said for some time that the USMCA trade agreement is his top priority for Congress. He wants that passed, and he wants it badly. And he's clearly chosen a poor strategy for accomplishing that. And at the same time, he may well even scuttle any hope of congressional cooperation on his immigration agenda. So instead of going 2 for 2, he might end up going 0 for 2.
0 for 2. Is it a common practice that we would necessarily pass this trade agreement before the other countries did?
No, countries do it on their own schedule, and they coordinate with each other, keep each other in the loop. And things change. Mexico had a change of presidency last year. Their new president took effect, or signing USMCA was the final act of the previous president. The current president, Lopez Obrador, was not in favor of the agreement, but he's going forward with it. Of kindness to the outgoing administration. And support is tenuous, which is another factor in the new Mexican problems.
Let me throw you a little bit of a curveball if I can, and that is in the previous administration we heard that we're going to allocate X number of hundreds of millions of dollars to climate change, or, over here to some kind of cancer study, or, just kind of these, government projects, if you will. I don't know where those monies come from. I mean, do those monies have to be approved when a White House comes out and says we're going to, give, $200 million to cancer research? What happens?
Yeah.
How does that work?
Congress holds the power of the purse.
Right.
So if President wants USMCA agreement as badly as he says he does, they have to give up any number of concessions. And to the extent that the new Mexican tariffs get in the way, that gives Democrats more things that they can oppose and do anything from the bill until non-trade provisions addressing labor or environmental causes that they have to that agreement, or they can ask for, well, we're not going to pass this agreement unless you give us our own standalone policy priorities. It puts the president in a much weaker negotiating position, and it might end up giving Democrats much more policymaking authority than they hold now.
I asked that question because I don't hear any part of our policy or trade or foreign policy platforms saying that we want to step in and help Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador, such that we would earmark $200 million to go into Honduras for manufacturing. I mean, do we just kind of leave that all to these cockamamie grant programs coming out of the State Department? Because, I mean, you had said, and I think you're right, the Mexicans are not so much the ones coming across this border, but they're using Mexico as just, a gateway, because we've got, people coming in from so many other countries. Most of which is Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador. So nobody is really speaking to taking any steps, diplomatic and economic steps in those countries. So a president, I would think, instead of the tariffs, he may go that direction. Would that be a prudent move? I
think you hit the nail on the head.
Thank you.
I just want some
validation on that one.
No, you're very welcome. You're absolutely right. I question the U.S. State Department's track record when it comes to successful nation building. So maybe that's not the best avenue, but yes, that is the right policy to pursue. Things better and where things are bad. People only tend to become refugees and seek asylum when things are less story.
Yeah.
So that's where policy priorities need to be.
Well, I mean, I don't want to necessarily call it nation building. I mean, we do these programs all over the world through USAID and the Millennium Challenge and the Meritive Initiative and all these other kind of cockamamie programs that we have. I was poking around the State Department's website the other day, and I saw the ridiculous dollars that are leaving our country, going to places that you'd have to go look up on a map to see if they really exist, for ridiculous objectives. And I would think we would look at some of those very carefully and make some other kinds of investments that would curb some of this migrant traffic. And I mean,
something is.
Go ahead.
A lot of countries have massive black markets and informal sectors because they don't have things as basic as property right titling. So if you don't own your house, you can't use it as collateral with a bank to start your own business or to do anything else with it that might improve the economy and living conditions for people who really need it. Those reforms ultimately have to come from within, and they have to be domestic. But there are things we in the U.S. can do to encourage the process, and that's where our priority should be. If your goal is to the amount of immigration, what you have to do is reduce the need for people to want to move away from terrible conditions.
We have this thing called Community Reinvestment Act. Why can't we use that model in some of those countries?
I question how effective that might ultimately be.
I don't like the Community Reinvestment Act. Believe me, yeah. I hate it. But I mean, we've been doing it for so long. Wouldn't that, take that kind of model and apply it as a test thing?
It would be preferable to what a lot of politicians in Washington are doing right now. There are better ways, but this would be an improvement over the status quo, certainly.
Okay, Mr. Ryan Young, you're going to go have a session with Nancy Pelosi on tariffs. What would you tell her?
I would tell her to pass bipartisan legislation that retakes tariff-making authority back from the president, puts it in Congress where it was for most of the country's history, because the president has proven that he's not using it to advance U.S. interests, whether it's tariffs against Europe or China or Mexico. He's not using them in a constructive, good faith manner that's advancing U.S. economic interests, let alone trade unrelated foreign policy objectives. So that needs to go back to Congress where it belongs. And there are 3 bills she can pass to do that. One for the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, one for a similar act from 1974, and now the third one having to do with an economic emergency powers that passed during the Carter.
If you were having a same kind of session with Trade Representative Lighthizer, what would you be saying to him?
I would look for him to find in-house solutions to basically rein in the president's trigger finger on these tariffs, because he's not necessarily following his advisor's advice. Lighthizer is apparently just livid over this latest development, even though he shares many of Trump's economic views. He is upset with current strategy.
Well, it's strategy, and I guess the other part of it's courtesy.
Yes,
isn't it?
Which is underrated in politics. I agree.
So when it comes to economic tariff financial strategies to kind of punish foreign governments for not helping us out and helping themselves out, as a knee-jerk reaction, what would you recommend in place of tariffs?
I'd say you catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. Every time we put a new tariff out, countries retaliate in kind. When we remove tariffs, things start moving. And there's also the matter that tariffs hurt ourselves. It's as though we're going to set our own house on fire until the neighbor puts their fire out. This is not an effective strategy. Or as another economist, Joan Robinson, once said, just because the other guy is dumping rocks into his harbor doesn't mean you respond by dumping rocks in your own harbor. And that's what U.S. trade policy is. I think we should engage in rock removal from our harbors and to cooperate with other countries to help them with their own. We're doing
dredging now, right? We're going to dredge the harbor. To be honest with you, I think I absolutely agree with all of this. I do want to, slap around Mexico here a little bit, but I think we tend to overlook, some other kind of mechanisms. We've been dumping on Mexico for a long time, and Mexico's been dumping on themselves, then dumping on us, and we keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting what is a different result. What do you think Mexico is saying to us right now? To stop with the ridiculousness and we'll do X, or what?
I think that's what it amounts to. They already made significant concessions to the U.S. in the USMCA agreement. To it anyway. There's no need for us to pile on. It's bad strategy. It alienates an important ally that we'll need for other fronts in foreign policy issues such as China. Mexico is also a major Pacific trader nation with significant Chinese contacts. We need Mexico to be an ally on trade issues and other foreign policy issues, not an enemy. And tariffs are winning us no friends on that front.
Well, you and I could probably go on and on and on for months on the whole China thing. Quite frankly, I think we should have been weaning ourselves from China for many years and looked at other countries like Vietnam and Sri Lanka and being replacing the manufacturing locations of our goods. Did I say that right, or do you have an argument with that statement?
That's actually already been happening to some extent.
Not enough,
right? If an iPhone made in China, they add about 3% of the value because they take parts that were made elsewhere in the U.S. and Canada and Japan, and they slap them together. It adds about $6 of value to a $500 phone. That's all China's doing. And we're finding that there are other countries who can do the same work, not only for lower wages, but also with more favorable, governments with fewer dysfunctions, shall we say, and maybe better human rights record. So that's already been happening to some extent. A lot of low-skilled manufacturing jobs, from textiles to musical instruments to things like computer chips, are being moved away from China and towards Indonesia, towards places like Bangladesh. They're moving up the chain of value in those countries, and I think that's benefiting both consumers and those countries. And it frees up Chinese labor that's gradually becoming more skilled and more educated to move into other sectors. That'll help that country as well.
I think you have a coin jar on your desk. So when you're looking at a lot of this financial tariff consequence, tax policy, and all these kinds of things, and then you see some of these congressional decisions and White House decisions, you probably are saying some bad words, and you got to go put a quarter in the jar. Does that happen to you every day?
That jar is rather fuller than I'd like it to be.
That's what I think too. I mean, it just sort of complicates, and it just doesn't need to be there. I don't think that there's a full thought on the wake of destruction here, and I think you probably are seeing it, and estimating the fallout, right?
Yeah, all told, the tariffs already enacted are enough to essentially wipe out Trump's big tax cut, which so far has been a signature policy achievement. He's undone it all, which is a real shame. It's a missed opportunity.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've been speaking with Ryan Young over at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. A lot of people don't like to talk about money and taxes and all those kinds of things, but the way you have been able to explain it to us, Ryan, has just been great. We appreciate your efforts, and I happen to agree with you, and I'm glad that you sort of validated what I've been thinking out here, and I'm just a burned out tennis player that does radio every once in a while. But thank you, Mr. Ryan Young, for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience. I may tap you on the shoulder again because you're real smart, and I like that.
Well, happy to be back. Thank you so much.
All right, thanks. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a pleasure having you with us, and we'll see you again very soon.